Is it time for a mind shift? If you don't know what that means, then join your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Christian pastor and Bible college teacher of over 20 years, along the journey of deconstruction and reconstruction of faith, life, religion, and spirituality.
I'm happy to be speaking here with sociologist Andrew Whitehead, co-author of the book Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States. Of course, we had Sam Perry on the show, your co-author, a while ago, so I'm really excited to speak with Andrew Whitehead. So thanks for being on the show, Andrew.
Hey, really happy to be here.
So I'm going to ask you a few questions I probably asked Sam, but I'm really interested to hear your response, obviously, as the co-author of this important book. Before we start, when I was interviewing Sam, I had just started listening to your book on Audible. So I felt like I didn't have a lot of the ammunition, to really go into that conversation. Now, however, I've finished the book. So now I've got a better idea of what you guys were arguing in the book. So I feel like hopefully I'm a little bit better informed. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thought you guys did a fantastic job.
Oh, thank you. That's awesome. That means a lot.
Yeah. Well, I asked Sam the same question. This is my opening question, but I'm interested to hear your answer. You're a sociologist. I was going to say you used to teach at Clemson, but you've switched institutions. Where are you now before we get started?
Yeah, so I'm at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. So a lot of times people refer to it as IUPUI. But we just moved to Indiana from South Carolina earlier this summer. So that's a big step. Wild, right in the middle of a pandemic. Yeah.
I'm going to say, moving must have been difficult.
Yeah.
Okay, you're a sociologist. So what led you to initially research and write about this topic of specifically Christian nationalism? What was it that got you into that subject?
Yeah, so like Sam, a sociologist, but generally interested in religion. And both he and I mostly focus on religion in the United States. And so I think for me, what really pushed me towards this topic was both professional and personal. So I grew up in a really religious community in northern Indiana. So it's kind of like everybody's, religious. Everybody kind of goes to church. It's not anything it's basically taken for granted. And with that, this
part of the social fabric.
Yeah, totally part of the social fabric. And with that, kind of this understanding of not only who we are as a community, but a nation. We're Christians, and to be American is to be Christian, and to be Christian, is almost to be American. So there's this really overlap. But kind of growing up, and then as I left that community, kind of seeing and thinking about, well, what is this history of Christianity in the U.S.? And so that's kind of where it overlapped with me professionally. We would analyze large survey data of the American public. And as we started to look at some of these questions of how people view the overlap between Christianity and like the federal government, whether they should advocate Christian values or that the U.S. is part of God's plan, we started to see that how Americans answer this was really powerful in explaining how they saw the world across a host of issues. And so over the years as we worked together, we got to the point where this I think really tells a broad story, because it isn't just like one significant predictor, but that it consistently was one of the strongest predictors of how Americans thought about their social worlds, both privately, but then publicly. And so for me, as I kind of came to terms with growing up in this religious area and eventually kind of, leaving this idea that the U.S. is a Christian nation that everybody took for granted, but then professionally to see, too, what it's connected with that is really problematic too. I think that was all a part of my interest in it and kind of ongoing interest as well.
As you say, it's absolutely fascinating, because I'm coming out of sort of the evangelical fundamentalist Christian world. I was raised in that. I grew up in the Seattle area, but I'm living over here in the UK. I've been here for almost 15 years. And it's really interesting to watch from across the pond.
I bet.
My British friends are constantly asking me, what the hell can you explain America to me? What's going on? Of course, with all the chaos of the last 4 years of the Trump administration, that's obviously an ongoing question. And then, of course, the massive evangelical support and all the rest of it. So I find myself having those conversations all the time with my British friends. So it's really interesting perspectives for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And I think in some ways, for me, I can speak for myself, growing up in that tradition kind of gives you, and I'm sure you're the same way, where you can speak the language, kind of how they explain things or just the way they view the world. And I'm still kind of deconstructing and trying to reconstruct kind of around that. And it's, difficult, but it's all a part of, coming to terms with the things that we're taking for granted, maybe not taking them for granted. And then what does this really mean in relation to, Christians in other countries, whether it's the UK or elsewhere, have very different views on some of these things compared to American Christians. And so what is going on there, I think is, super interesting.
It is interesting. That's probably the biggest distinction. Living here in the UK, yes, we obviously have Christians, but even though the term evangelical here in the UK doesn't mean the same thing it means in the States, it just means generically sort of a Bible-believing Christian, doesn't have any of the connotations of what you'd think of an evangelical in America, and they're not hardly at all involved in politics, nothing like the American context. So that's a huge difference right there. And obviously Europe in general is trending more toward becoming a secularist area. You go into these cathedrals and they're lovely. I love them, but they're empty pretty much, and it's the older people is dying out. So we're seeing here in Europe is completely different. So absolutely fascinating stuff. I'm a student of history like you. I love, how all these forces have sort of played and worked together, so I'm fascinated by it. But what I'm really interested, the reason I reached out to talk to you was that I was kind of hoping we could head towards sort of two main areas. The first one is the obviously upcoming election. That's on everybody's mind, what's going to happen and all the rest of it. But in your book, you guys talk about the point of Christian nationalism. That's a predictor, as you say, of perhaps the way a person might vote. So what does that play into the Trump support and all that? Then the second thing, of course, is what's on everyone's mind even more is the fact that Ruth Bader Ginsburg has just passed away. There's this promise by the Republicans that they're going to ram a third candidate through before the election. What role does Christian nationalism play in that whole piece? So I'm curious to find out, why is it so important for people to know this piece about Christian nationalism is such a major predictor of how people vote, especially for Trump?
Yeah, definitely. So we found, with data collected soon after 2016, we were able to ask these series of questions that kind of tap into how people, how much they embrace Christian nationalism. So we might ask them, do you believe that the success of the United States is part of God's plan? The federal government should advocate Christian values. We should allow religious symbols in public spaces. And so they could, on a spectrum, strongly agree to strongly disagree with that. And then we assigned a point value to each one. And then when we put all those together, we had a scale from 0 to 24. So if you strongly agreed with all of those, you're at the very high end. You really, really embrace Christian nationalism. And then if you reject all 6 of those statements or, strongly disagree, you're a 0 and you reject it. And so we found Americans were distributed pretty evenly across this whole scale. So it isn't just a question of, do you think the U.S. is a Christian nation, yes or no, but to what extent do you want to see Christianity privileged? And again, it's kind of a Christianity in quotes, because in the book, we kind of pull this thread where there's a lot of assumptions that come with saying you believe it's a Christian nation. You're generally saying it's a white, Protestant, patriarchal, nativist nation, right? We, these people, and usually white Protestant males or, females, but patriarchal. And so what we found was when we took into account, how much they embrace Christian nationalism, and then try to predict the Trump vote, it was the strongest religious predictor. So a lot of times, the media will discuss, an election happened, what was the religion effect, or how did religion play into it? But we found that it really didn't matter if you were evangelical Protestant or Catholic or even unaffiliated. There were no differences between those religious groups. What mattered was the extent to which you embraced Christian nationalism. It didn't really matter how often you attended church. What really mattered was if you embraced Christian nationalism. And so this is what was really fascinating to us, is that in explaining, the religious vote for Trump, it didn't come down to kind of really personal religious practice or affiliation. What really mattered was, do you think that Christianity should be privileged in the public sphere, have access to power and privilege? And that is what pushed a lot of religious Americans towards Trump. So they attend church a lot. and they may be evangelical. But if you attend church a lot and are an evangelical and reject Christian nationalism, which there are Americans that do that,
absolutely.
you did not vote for Trump. But if you were a white liberal Protestant who embraced Christian nationalism, you were just as likely to vote for Trump as a white evangelical. And so it really cut across those denominational lines, which I think was super fascinating to us, in the fact that a lot of times, people say, well, it was, evangelicals or the white evangelicals that went for Trump. And they did, but it was because they embraced Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism is the variable, that's the mechanism that's really connecting, some of these religious affiliations or racial and religious groups to support for Trump. And so we found that in 2016, and lately we've been asking questions of who people intend to vote for. And sure enough, if you embrace Christian nationalism, you're going to vote for Trump. You're overwhelmingly.
Yeah, you're on the Trump train.
Yep, for sure.
Yeah. So in other words, your research, the statistics are bearing out then in this upcoming election, as you say. You researched that in 2016, and we're seeing the same pattern. I mean, we know just statistically, Trump's base is pretty much almost identical to what it was in 2016. So it hasn't gone anywhere, maybe a few percentage points, but nothing major. Now, I know you've been asked this a million times before, and you've kind of skirted around it a little bit. What actually is Christian nationalism? Because in your book, you say it's more about a cultural framework. I found a great quote. You said, it's a cultural framework that involves, quote, an ideology that idealizes and advocates a fusion of American civic life with a particular type of Christian identity and culture, end quote. So that was the definition in your book. How would you add anything to that?
No, we've really kind of landed on that through working it out in different articles. And so I really like that, because as a cultural framework, really what we're saying is it operates like a lens through which people are seeing, the social world. So everything that happens around them gets refracted through that. But then too, as they, see the social world and then act within it, they're also working through that lens. And so it isn't just the narrative of the U.S. as a Christian nation, but also these symbols and, the myths connected to those, and this identity where it becomes something like, this is who we are and what we're all about. And to be a citizen of this country is to be like we are. And so it has a historical bent, right? It goes through history, but really too, we're looking within the rise of religious right in the 70s, and as they responded to the civil rights movement in the 60s. I think what we're seeing now is a lot of that whole movement play out, where Trump is kind of the end result of that. But yeah, I think Christian nationalism as this complex of attitudes and beliefs and views about what it means to be an American and be Christian, I think is the key to how they see and interpret their social worlds. It
is fascinating, isn't it? Because this whole aspect of guys like David Barton, I think I don't know if you mentioned him in the book, but I did a podcast recently with Dr. Warren Throckmorton. I don't know if you've come across his work, but he spent years debunking David Barton. So we did a show a couple months ago talking specifically about Barton. And the fact that Barton is fascinating because he is a character. He's not even a historian. He portrays himself as one. He claims he has a PhD and all the rest of it. It was an honorary doctorate. He said it was an earned doctorate. But anyway, his whole thing is he provides, I think, that quote unquote historical background for that Christian nationalist piece. I remember this from your book. You say, you can answer any one of these questions. Do you believe that America was a Christian nation? Or do you believe that America is currently a Christian nation? Or do you believe America should be a Christian nation in the future? If you believe any one or all three of those, you're probably a Christian nationalist of some variety.
Yeah, and what was so interesting about that too is even building on, you could have people that reject Christian nationalism as we measure it, but might say, well, in the past it was, right? We maybe were a Christian nation, but we're not anymore. So it is this historical view, but really it's about not are we or were we, but should we be? So should we be a country where Christianity is privileged? And to those that say yes, that I think is where we're really tapping into the Christian nationalism, because they have a vision of what this country should be, should look like, and how we should get there. So not only where we should go, but this is the way that we got to get there. And again, that's where the rubber meets the road in social policy, which again is what we see a lot of what's happened in the last 4 years and in other administrations as well, but especially in the Trump administration.
And that's what led me to your work, was that I came in the other way, because my background is theological and biblical, coming out of, that was my background as an academic and a Bible college teacher. So I started researching dominion theology.
Yep.
I saw that series, The Family. That's what got me started a few years ago on Netflix with Jeff Charlotte. And then I got into R.J. Rushdoony and Christian Reconstructionism. So that's the path that I came to. What seems to me, there was a kind of a sea change around that time of the founding of the Moral Majority and those sort of organizations in the late 70s, early 80s, whereby the focus changed from sort of evangelizing your friends, neighbors, coworkers, relatives, to actually saying, wait a minute, we need to get involved on the political level. And it's all about now power and preserving power. And as you say, it seems like the results of that, decades ago are what we're seeing now, especially as I'm sure we'll talk about this upcoming Supreme Court judge choice. That's a big part of this whole narrative.
For sure. Yeah. And I think you're right on with some of those kind of historical figures. And Julie Ingersoll's book, Building God's Kingdom, really lays that out really well too, with Rushdoony, and how a lot of those things used to be kind of fringe, but then have slowly made their way and now are much more mainstream. Even in, broader evangelical thought, they don't see kind of what Rushdoony was actually saying, where he's like, we should literally stone gays and lesbians, or, people that dishonor their father and mother, like return to Old Testament laws. So they kind of would, lose some of the rough edges, but this idea of we need to control the culture, definitely came in. And like you said too, with the rise of the moral majority, as they responded to the civil rights movement, you see people like Jerry Falwell, where as Martin Luther King Jr. and others are marching for equality, he's saying, the role of a Christian is to live faithfully and to not get involved in politics. But that was because they didn't want to get involved in these types of politics of equality for African Americans. But then in the 70s, he completely flips, where now, no, we need to be involved. We need to exert our power and privilege to, he says, protect the family, protect our culture, all of those things. But again, as we show, it has less to do with some of that and more with their particular view of what society should look like, both gender, sexuality, racially. All those things are wrapped up in it. I'm
fascinated by the other piece. Of course, there's this aspect of Christian nationalism that upholds this narrative, or maybe we could say it's actually a myth, guys like David Barton and others, that America was a Christian nation. It was founded expressly to be a Christian nation. And in that, there's a narrative that says, actually, not only was it founded as a Christian nation, we had a unique covenant status with God. And somehow it's all part of, we've got to live up to these standards, almost like Old Testament Israel. If we follow the laws of God, he will bless the nation. If we disobey the laws of God, he will judge America. And one of the big single topic issues, of course, that came out of the moral majority was abortion. Even though that really wasn't, the basis was more about racism and segregation academies. But guys like Paul Weyrich, he was critically important in saying, if we could get people organized around this issue of abortion, that's where we could get the voting bloc motivated to vote for Reagan and Bush and people like that. So what's the significance now in this upcoming Supreme Court fight of that Christian nationalist covenant theology piece as you see it?
Yeah, definitely. No, I think that's a great history. Like what you're talking about with how the moral majority kind of coalesced as they tried to, activate this large voting bloc, like you said. And Randall Ballmer's work, I'm sure you've read, where he really draws that out as just wonderful, where, abortion was kind of like an afterthought. Like, Catholics care about it, but would this get people riled up? But then, as a political movement, they made a case for why you should care and all these things. And they've been successful in that because, as I grew up, and maybe you too, to vote anything other than Republican was to, murder babies, right? Exactly. It just became that clear where, like, how could you not vote Republican? Because, the Democrats, they're just, and the rhetoric is even worse now, some of the stuff that gets said, but I see, on Facebook with people, that, literally murdering babies, that's exactly what you're voting for. And so that's been a whole history as they've, pushed this through. And so I think, you're connecting the dots where this idea that we're a Christian nation, that to be blessed, we have to do the right things. And Franklin Graham and Robert Jeffress and some other kind of figureheads of Christian nationalism will say this all the time, where if we expect God's blessing, we have to live up to God's rules. And so as a nation, we need to do that. And so for them, that's key, where, no divorce, although that's less of an issue now than it was in the 70s, but no abortion, no rights for same-sex couples or people that are, across the LGBTQ spectrum. We have to, traditional sexuality, all of those things. But then too, there's all these other things that get added on with communism and globalism and socialism and all that. So they push this in here, but abortion is still that activator where people, that we've interviewed for the book, you see that in there and in later studies, where when you ask them about Trump, for some of them, they'll say, I don't like how he talks. I don't like how he, denigrates women, or
how he tweets.
Literally, tweets, pick anything. I mean, there's tons that they don't like.
So much not to like.
Yeah, totally. And some of them will see it, but then when it comes down to it, they just are like, but the Supreme Court and abortion. And we've got to do that. Now, there are studies that are showing that really abortion isn't the thing that will push them, that views towards like immigration or racial issues are really what are coalescing for them. But I think still in their minds, it comes down to the Supreme Court and what's happening there. And so, as they see defending this Christian country, it will be about getting the right justices to, again, overturn Roe v. Wade, which with tons of scholarship shows that even if Roe v. Wade falls, all that does is it leaves it to the states to decide. So there will be some states that might outlaw it and others that won't. So it doesn't know it's going to end abortion. And laws generally don't lower abortion rates at all. It's like healthcare and contraception, all those things, but that doesn't matter. Like, the narrative has been set, and to be a Christian nation, we have to get rid of Roe v. Wade. And that is so ingrained over the last 50 years that, it will continue to push them towards Trump, towards the GOP, who will use that to their advantage.
We are just taking a real short break here in my chat with Andrew Whitehead, who, as I mentioned at the top of the show, is the co-author along with Sam Perry of Taking America Back for God. And if you haven't heard the chat with Sam, you should go back after you finish this one, of course, with Andrew. Go back and listen to that, because we delve into actually a lot more about the book. I was really interested to talk to Andrew because, of course, this is why this is a bonus episode. I'm getting it out quickly because obviously we've got the election coming up, and we've got this issue now that suddenly popped up with the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The Republicans are trying to shove through a third Supreme Court justice, who of course is now been named as Amy Coney Barrett, who is a conservative Catholic, and there's a lot of questions swirling around her involvement with this group called the People of Praise and everything else. A lot of people are saying this is a cult and what's going on here, so a lot more investigation has to be done. However, it looks likely that she's going to be ramrodded through before the election, which of course is hugely ironic because it was Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham and other GOP leaders who were saying during Obama's final year, when he was proposing to put Merrick Garland on the Supreme Court, they took this moral high ground saying, well, no, it's not right to appoint a Supreme Court justice during the final year of a presidency. We should wait until the next president gets elected. Now, of course, where's all that talk? It's rank hypocrisy. It's power politics at play. But actually, if you look at the statistics, it shows that the majority of Americans, there's two things. One, they do not support this notion of shoving a Supreme Court justice through literally weeks before the election. And then second, they support what the Republicans were saying almost exactly 4 years ago now, that we should wait until after the election, until the new president is sworn in, whoever that may be, whether it's Trump again or Joe Biden, and then do it properly. But of course, they don't care that they're being accused of hypocrisy. And what we're seeing here, and this is why I wanted to talk to Andrew, we're seeing this is Christian nationalism that's driving so much of this. This is red meat to Trump's base, the evangelical base. And so this is the reason why I'm doing this podcast, why I've been focusing so much on dominion theology, the Christian right, Christian Reconstructionism, Christian nationalism, homeschooling, and all these other areas, they all come together, especially in this realm of cult psychology, because what we're seeing really, I think, is the cult of Trump. He's taken over the Republican Party, and he's got these blindly loyal followers who you can't use reason, you can't talk to them, and you show them facts or logic because they'll just say, well, it's fake news. And this is something that Chris Shelton and I talked about a few weeks ago in our episode on QAnon, how logic, facts, it doesn't matter. That's a cult too. And that's all somehow wrapped up in this support for Trump. So it's really important to educate yourself. It's hard to find sources of true news that aren't fake or at least distorted by some bias. So that's why I do this podcast. Now, I wanted to say really quickly that what's coming up in the next few weeks, kind of going back on this theme of deconstructing Christianity, we talked about Christian hegemony with Paul Kivel a few weeks ago, and then my episode dropped just recently with Stephen Tiger as we looked at Doctrine Impossible. And I'm also going to pick that up on the following episode of Mindshift Podcast with Matthew Taylor of the Still Unbelievable podcast. He stopped by The Rock a few weeks back on the end of August. Actually, it was the last bank holiday weekend of August here in the UK. And we spent a good chunk of time kind of comparing our stories, our deconstruction, our deconversion out. And speaking of deconversion, I wanted to mention that it's still not too late. I'm hosting a Zoom call with my good friend Janice Selby from Canada. She's a therapist there. On the 3rd of October, we're going to do that at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, which of course would be 6 p.m. here in the UK, so you can work out the different time zones. Janice is trying to reach out to specifically males who have come out of fundamentalism, evangelicalism. If you fall into that category and you're looking to sort of not just deconstruct, but reconstruct, rebuild your identity, that's going to be the topic of that call. So it's still not too late to get on that Zoom call Saturday, the 3rd of October. So you can send me a DM on Twitter. You can follow me at Mindshift 2018. You can also find Janice at Divorce Religion on Twitter as well. You can get more information on that call, or you can drop into my Mindshift Podcast Facebook page. I've got a link. I've created an event there, so you can message me on Facebook to find out more details and get the Zoom link for that call. So that's a really cool thing coming up. And speaking finally of Zoom calls, we've got Andrew Whitehead as well as Sam Perry dropping in for our November Zoom call. So on the 22nd of November, we're going to be doing that, and that's always a closed thing. And in fact, we've got Paul Kivel. He's going to be dropping in October. So we've got some really cool Zoom calls. These are benefits that you get for supporting this show on Patreon. You get to be part of our closed Mindshift Podcast Facebook group, and then you get access to these Zoom calls where we typically have former guests of the show come back, and we spend an hour to an hour and a half talking to them, getting to know them, looking at their work. So it's absolutely amazing that we've got both Sam and Andrew coming in November, as well as Paul Kivel dropping in October, as we're going to talk about his work on Christian hegemony, how to resist that. So let's get on back into the call with Andrew Whitehead as we continue looking at this issue of the upcoming Supreme Court justice fight, as well as the Trump election and its connections to Christian nationalism. But the funny thing is, or I should say maybe the ironic thing is that even if they do succeed in overturning Roe versus Wade, which seems that, I just say it could actually happen here, they'll have to pick a new battle, a new enemy then. You know, it's like years ago they were they were anti-communist and they were supportive of the government's position during the Cold War. But then when that all went away, in effect, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we've got to pick a new enemy. So they turned around. Now it's the war on terror. You see a lot of Islamophobia. Yep. So there'll be something else that they find. So
totally.
This is not over by any stretch.
For sure. Yeah. Kristen Dumais' new book, Jesus and John Wayne, was really great. And she kind of pulls this thread too, where the kind of militant evangelical masculinity, they're constantly looking for, an enemy on the outside that we have to battle. And so, it was communism. Some
dragon to slay.
Exactly. Yeah. And a woman to rescue and all that stuff. Eldridge. But it was communism and that falls. So then they're looking around, well, what do we do? And then it, was kind of this globalism, socialism, New World Order, Pat Robertson's book in 1990, like we got to be afraid. Mm-hmm. So they were with the Clinton administration, the influence of the United Nations and stuff. They're like, we got to get rid of this. And then 9/11 happens. And so now they find
that was it.
Enemy. Yeah. And just like you said, they've got this enemy, they're going to go for it. So I think when Roe v. Wade falls, they will find something else to be afraid of and to use that to activate. And so I think there are a lot of Americans who are concerned about, the unborn, but when it just stops there and we see a lot of these religious people then don't care as much about providing health care to, the mom or the child after the baby's born, or, as they go through school, or the whole gamut of life issues. When they just stop at that one, it's hard, for those on the outside not to see this as hypocrisy. And so they will find something new, but it is a powerful force, even still.
Well, as I mentioned, I was reading your book just as I started talking to Sam a couple months ago. So now that I've read it, I understand these 4 categories you've got in the book. Okay, so you've got kind of on the spectrum, as you mentioned before, from, I guess, left to right, maybe.
Yeah.
Rejectors. You got rejectors, resistors, accommodators, and ambassadors. And of course, it's the rejectors and the resistors. They're probably not going to vote for Trump. They're resisting or rejecting the myth of Christian nationalism. It seems to me, when I looked at those statistics, it's the accommodators that everyone's really fighting over. The ambassadors, they're Trumpists for the most part. They are diehard Christian nationalists. They're on the Trump train. They're probably into QAnon and all the rest of it. But everyone's going to be fighting over that, maybe the undecideds that lean a little bit more toward the Christian nationalism myth.
Yeah, totally. No, you're right on. The ambassadors are the ones that really strongly embrace Christian nationalism, and they are, by and large, are going to, vote for Trump. They've been on the Trump train, as you've said. But accommodators and ambassadors are a little under 20%. So they're the smallest group of the 4 in the U.S. And accommodators are that group that actually the largest. They're about a third. So they're kind of from the midpoint of that scale up to what we call a standard deviation above. So they're kind of, they accept that Christianity played a role in the U.S. They see and believe that it could play a positive role in civic life. But while they are supportive of that, their support isn't comprehensive, right? They still think other religions should be a part of it and that it shouldn't be privileged, maybe to the extent where it's the only one that has access to power. And so they are the ones, I think, that are really key, where, they are probably faithful people in their religion, how they practice it, but their quest for that power isn't to the degree that ambassadors are. And so how can those on the other side of the political spectrum make a case for these Americans, right? So I think, there are different discussions going on and people fall on different sides as to whether Democrats should, quote unquote, like waste their time with, white Christians, that they're all for Trump no matter what. And I understand those. Like, I get what they're saying, because white Christians, by and large, did support Trump. However, margins are really important in an election. And so to the degree that Democrats and, political progressives are able to not denigrate faith, because these people, they will say that, maybe Christianity should be privileged to some extent, or that we're a Christian nation, but they see it as an important part of their lives. And so I'm reading right now Jack Jenkins' book on progressive religion, American Prophets. And so he's kind of showing, in different periods of, the Obama administration and even more lately, just how the progressive faith leaders, what they're doing in politics. And so he's kind of showing, and I think it's instructive, that when Obama was running and even during his administration, he could talk to those people of faith. And a lot of them were, anti-Democrats and him, but there were many, especially younger Americans who might have been religious that, bought into this idea of a pluralistic democratic society where you could be of different religions and still be focused on a common good. And those types of things that kind of a liberal or progressive faith tradition historically kind of held to in the U.S. And so I think accommodators would be open to that, because faith is a big part of their life, but maybe providing them different tools, or at least lenses through which they could interpret their faith in relation to how we structure our society, both, politically, but also just socially, like who has access to power and all those things. So I think those accommodators are key to this election, and in the future for us to, be able to live and work together and have an actual democracy, which honestly is in the, it's an open question.
Hanging in the balance, right?
Totally.
Now.
Yeah. It's an open question in the fall. And so to the degree that, accommodators and resistors, those groups that are kind of in the middle, get involved, because we also find, it got cut from the book, but we find that they tend to be less engaged politically than the rejectors and the ambassadors. So getting that middle engaged, I think, is key if we're going to be able to protect whatever we have left, I guess.
Yeah. And I know this isn't really what we're talking about, but I'm personally very, very concerned about what's going to happen. A lot of people think that Donald Trump is going to pull something around about election day. He'll, declare an emergency, or there'll be riots or whatever. And then he'll say, well, look, this is a chaotic situation. We better send in the troops and suspend all voting. And I'm going to declare myself president for life. I don't know what's going to happen. But the funny thing is, of course, you've got these ambassadors cheering him on. I mean, what's in it for them? Okay, so if they win Trump re-election and if they win a Supreme Court nominee, what then? Because it seems like a Pyrrhic victory. It's a scorched earth policy. Okay, you won in air quotes, but what about the backlash? What about the residual effect on the back end? They're not thinking about any of that, it seems to me.
No, I think you're right. I agree. I don't think there is a lot of thought as to, what it means to build a society around this, or even one that works for everybody. Because I think to them, they're not worried about that. I think to the degree that they are able to maintain access to power, which Trump will provide them as long as they give him what he wants. But yeah, I think it is, what I think will be key is what we'll continue to see, because this started in the 90s. This isn't a new thing, but Americans leaving religious institutions and identifying as unaffiliated, right? It started in the 90s. It's continued to grow. At least, there's a lot of different, but some of the best data we have is, at least a quarter of the population is unaffiliated. Now, some of them are spiritual and religious, but then, a portion of them have rejected religion altogether. But what I think we're going to see is, for a lot of, especially the white Christian organizations, you're going to see people continue to leave because, again, it was kind of pushing all the chips into privilege and power. But what does that mean for the faith tradition itself? What happens to it? And I think there's, different writers and pastors, that are kind of pointing out how similar to, selling a birthright, to like draw on the biblical story of Esau, right? Like, selling the birthright for a mess of porridge, this power, but what is it going to mean for us in the end? Because you look at, 10 years ago when you asked them, is to be a moral person really key to like being a good holding a political office? And like 70-80% of white evangelicals said yes. And then when Trump's elected, like a literal 70-30 split, like they go to 30%. Oh, you don't need to, you just gotta privileged Christianity. And so I think the chickens will come home to roost at some point in the future, and it remains to be seen. But there's going to be a backlash.
It's fascinating. There's some interesting insights to the evangelical mind. I was thinking this morning, I listened to a podcast, the daily podcast this morning from the New York Times. I was driving to work, and it's absolutely fascinating. The title of the episode is called A Historic Opening for Anti-Abortion Activists, kind of a long title, but the guest, she was a woman named Marjorie Dannenfelser. I don't know if you've heard of this woman, but she's the president of the anti-abortion organization, the Susan B. Anthony List, and she's an evangelical, anti-abortion. And this interview was all about what's your perspective on the new upcoming Supreme Court nomination and all the rest of it? And the host of the podcast asked her, well, it's no secret that the majority of Americans support reproductive rights, and they're generally positive toward Roe versus Wade. They do not want to overturn it. So you've got a minority of people who are fighting, and it looks like they may well win, in air quotes. Absolutely fascinating, because she said in the end, he asked her, will it have been worth it if you lose the presidency and perhaps the Senate controlled majority of GOP if you get this pushed through? And she said essentially, yes, it will be. Yeah, it'll be worth it. I mean, that's the definition of a Pyrrhic victory right there. Scorched earth, man. So she's an ambassador. I'm thinking on the way, I'm thinking about, I'm going to talk to Andrew about this,
No, I would agree. And I think it's true, like what their aim is. And this is it's fascinating on a very scholarly level, but then too, there's very real human repercussions of it. And so I hesitate to use that term, but this idea that with demographic change and the change of attitudes towards, you could look at same-sex marriage or even abortion, like you said, a majority support it. The GOP or, the conservative political religious operatives recognizing that demographics aren't on their side and the trend of public, how people view it, public opinion isn't necessarily on their side. And so being able to kind of create a bulkhead within the judiciary of, the laws, being able to overturn it or create laws or defend laws or how it's interpreted, that is a way to continue to have unequal accesses to power, right? And what you want to see the world look like, continue on, even if they are the minority demographically and on opinion polls or whatever else. And so I think they see that as the future, and they've spent decades building up that infrastructure and the institutions to do that. And now, right, they're kind of punching way above their weight, if you can put it that way.
Absolutely. And of course, as we said before, guys like Rushdoony, he would be rejoicing, I think, on many levels to see his sort of some aspects of his vision coming up. That's the question. Is this a theocracy that we're heading toward? Are guys like Rushdoony, dominionist, guys like Lance Wallnau, Cindy Jacobs, people like that, are they happy? Are they trying to establish a theocracy? Because one of the things Warren Throckmorton said that really stuck with me, he said, if you look at the definition of a theocracy, you have to think about it like this. He said, it's about everyone in that society has to obey God's laws, whether you're a believer or not, whether you accept it or not, you must obey. And that was a chilling vision, I thought. And that's essentially what we're seeing here. As we said, the majority don't want Roe versus Wade overturned. But you know what? If they do it, it's going to be the law. And people are now going to have to obey that law. So are we seeing a theocracy, the rumblings of a theocracy, do you think?
That's a really great question. It's one that I'll have to think more on, because, there's a point, too, where some of these things are so disconnected from the theology of a historic Christian faith in some ways, where they, ignore some things, but then other things they're going to focus on, and it's not even really biblical at all, but it's just what's become packaged as this is, what Christians think. And so I think to the extent that, they're able to have people in positions of power that are able to execute their vision for the country, that's what they want. And I think the people in power like Trump, he doesn't really care for religious folks. And, there's record of him saying, who are these people and can you believe they believe this bullshit and all this stuff. But he'll say the words, he'll stand in front of a church in Lafayette Square holding a Bible, just silly stuff, but they rejoice and they see it as like, that is God's anointed and he is the one that's going to protect us because they feel as though they're under siege. And so, I mean, I don't necessarily disagree with Throckmorton and his view of what that means. I think it's provocative, but it makes sense.
It is. And the one thing, as I was driving to work, I'm like hoping that this interviewer is going to ask this woman, this Marjorie Dannenfelser, the question, because I just finished going through Michael Cohen's book, Disloyal, as you say, and that's where that quote comes from, isn't it? Where one of the first meetings of all these evangelicals, and I think Paula White, she owned a flat in Trump's, one of his buildings in New York. Anyway, and then he turns to him and says, God, you believe these people believe this bullshit? But it's obvious that it's a transactional agreement. And one of the things I was hoping the host would ask her, and he didn't, was, could you possibly admit that you're being played here? That this is nothing more. Trump is not a Christian. And she went on this long rant about, he's clearly a Christian. He's, he's definitely saved. He's a baby Christian, but he's a rough around the edges, but he's, and I'm like, that's bullshit. I mean, he's not a Christian. He's playing you. You're getting something from him. He's getting something in return. So what about the fact that you're being suckered in? And of course, he didn't ask her that. I was hoping he would. But Trump, as we know, is a deeply transactional. That's how he conducts his businesses and that personal relationships. To me, that seems like that's really what this whole thing is about, as you say. And they just overlooked all of the stuff they claimed to stand for in exchange for power. And it's a chilling thing.
Yeah, no, I think that is very interesting, the transactional part of it. I think, one thing that, I guess to return to Kristen Dumais' book and plug that again, but she really points out too that with this history of militant evangelical masculinity, and it is a long history, that Trump is like the natural and perfect endpoint of it. He was exactly who they were looking for. And so with Jeffress, saying we want the meanest son of a, and he wouldn't say, son of a gun. And then
he wouldn't swear.
Tony Perkins, the head of the Family Research Council, saying, we want somebody to punch the bully. I think for some of them, they realize he, isn't maybe kind of this vision of Christ-likeness. But then too, I think their vision of Christ-likeness has been, and Kristen kind of makes this point, has been created in this culture to be a John Wayne type figure that goes in there, roughs people up when it needs to be roughed up, and will do what they have to do to defend the honor and defend the women and defend the faith. And that's what they want, and that's what they see. And so it's really, so it could be transactional. And then I think, you could also say and argue too that that's exactly what they've wanted all along. And so they're happy to see him in power and to do the things that he does and the way that he does it. And so it isn't a surprise. This was what they wanted all along.
Absolutely. Someone said maybe the cruelty is the point.
Yep.
And I've come to see recently, I've changed my views on this as an ex-evangelical. I used to say that their support of Trump was inconsistent with their theology and their worldview. I've changed that, and I'm kind of more like what you're saying. I say, no, it's actually consistent with their theology, because not to get into the theological aspect, but the God of the Bible, as preached in much of evangelicalism, is a kind of a tyrant figure, and he's xenophobic and kind of racist and pro-slavery and commands genocide, and he's an ass-kicking, butt-kicking God.
Yeah.
And there's a guy, I don't know if you know this guy, Frank Amedia, it got this ministry called the POTUS Shield. It's one of these apostolic ministries, like Seven Mountains Dominion Theology guys. He just came out a few days ago and said, essentially, God put Ruth Bader Ginsburg to death. He cleared the path for a conservative pro-life judge to come on the bench. And he also said, look, you better watch your backs. Anyone who is opposing, God's on the steamroller path right now. And he cited a bunch of verses from the Old Testament where God went in and slaughtered the enemy, so to speak, and had him put to death. And he said, look, man, this is our God. And that's what he's just done. You better watch your backs. And so I'm going, that's proof right there. That is consistent with this theology. So it's not something that's out of whack. It's actually chillingly all too accurate.
Yeah, totally. And there's a great paper by another sociologist, Gerardo Marti, where he kind of points out that Trump in many ways was fully orthodox, because a lot of people be like, oh, he's so unorthodox, within evangelicalism. But he's like, no, in many ways he is fully orthodox, because it's about keeping access to political power, having a particular end in mind. And so the political and cultural influence, that's what they've wanted. And so that's what he's about. And so it was part of what they've always kind of been working towards in that sense.
Well, I like what you say about Kristen Dumais. I've had her on the show a couple times.
That's awesome.
We had a lot in common, because when I read her book, it struck me that was a lot of my own story growing up in evangelicalism, going to Promise Keepers events, men's rallies, getting in touch with your emotions and being a tough Christian, and that toxic evangelical masculinity. And as you say, it really, all that stuff has laid the groundwork for a guy like Trump, the biblical patriarchy and all that. And so, I agree. And I think what I've seen is, as I've read different books, Sarah Posner and Amanda Marcotte and Catherine Stewart and Kristen Dumais, it's a patchwork quilt where you got to kind of put all these pieces together and say all of that together. And you and Sam Perry's book, all these factors contribute to what we're seeing now with the whole rabid Trump support by these ambassadors.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think that's too what we tried to do, and what we enjoyed about the book was, drawing on journalists and historians, but we're able to really chart out empirically how these things play out in Americans' minds across the country, where we're able to show, that the patriarchy, the xenophobia, the nationalism, the Islamophobia, fear of atheists, and even fears of Jewish Americans, so other religious minorities or non-religious. And then within the family, gender and sexuality, we're able to kind of see how this idea of Christian nationalism, this cultural framework, is connected to, the gender, sexuality, nativism, and especially racism is what's happening in the U.S. right now, where there's no question that we ask in our scale that actually explicitly mentions race, right? It's just about Christianity and religion in the public sphere. But we find that it is so intimately intertwined with their views towards racial issues, right? So racial justice issues, ambassadors are more likely to believe that, cops shoot Black Americans more often because Black Americans are more violent. So kind of explicitly racist things where, again, what's wrapped up in this nationalism is this idea of a white America, and that it was built for white people. And so what they're able to do is kind of cloak their religious or their racial beliefs in religious symbolism and kind of, shunt those off to the side so they're able to say what they want. And so, with all these different things that people are kind of finding, we're able to kind of show that this, in the minds of most Americans, right, as we're creating these surveys, that these things are immensely powerful across a host of issues.
And I think that's why your book is so important, because, as you say, it gives you the sociological data, the hard research. You got the numbers and as we're saying, we're seeing it borne out again. And you can tie that into books like Sarah Posner's Unholy, where she makes the case that the Christian right is increasingly climbing in bed with the alt-right, which is another disturbing trend. As you're talking about the racist piece, the white supremacist piece, the two groups increasingly are becoming harder and harder to distinguish and separate. So there's a very disturbing and frightening trend. You're seeing these militia groups roaming the streets, and they're supposedly standing up for law and order along with Trump. And so there's a lot of stuff going on. So if you want the sociological data, definitely, it sounds like, get your book, Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States. Thank you so much, Andrew. I've absolutely enjoyed talking to you. I'm glad that now I've got the second half of the duo. I've talked to Sam, and now I was able to interview you. No, you have a very different perspective on it that is very helpful. So I was going to ask you too, before I let you go, how can people find you on social media?
Yeah, so I am at, and it's my name, Andrew Whitehead, but the A is the at. So it's, at the at sign, NDREWWHITEHEAD. So I tried to be clever, but it's just harder to explain, but that's where we're at. So I'm on Twitter there, and so is Sam at Social the Sacred. And so we're always kind of tweeting out new data that we're finding, or that that Sam's been collecting, and kind of new papers, what we're showing. So would love to see and interact with anybody on there.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed talking to you, and I will speak to you again.
I hope so. This has been awesome.